Here on today's podcast, we have George Kennedy. George Kennedy is the founder and editor of Who Shapes Our Times, a debate think tank which shares ideas and engages others in what he defines as issues central to the functioning of a viable and healthy society. And Lord knows, after what we've been through here in America the past 4 years, we definitely need a healthy society. George is also a former senior Foreign Service officer and advisor, a policy analyst and teacher. At his core, he is a man passionate about the mechanics of what makes people tick and the national and global politics that impact their daily lives. And at this intersection of people and politics, where those two factions meet, in the crosshairs, if you will, that is where George is at his most engaging when talking to him. He is extremely passionate about it. And speaking of crosshairs, George is also, if you can believe this, the author of 9 books, including the political thriller trilogy, his Crosshairs series. All of his books are available on Amazon at George Alfred Kennedy, at the George Alfred Kennedy page. He is unquestionably a dear friend of mine and a mentor, and the one person I could not wait to have on this podcast to discuss how we move from catchphrases like thoughts and prayers for victims to real concrete policies in the fight for child sexual abuse victims like myself. So George, I thought that was a great introduction. I have never given quite a glowing introduction to anyone before, so I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. I've got a great smile on my face here, and I certainly appreciate it.
Okay. So you and I have known each other going on 8 years. And you were with me the day this entire book, Helplessness came out. You were amongst the many people in the room who appeared to be stunned by what I had to say, especially it coming not only from a Black man, but from a brother who has had to try to come to grips with ways of dealing with the emotional trauma that comes with finding out that your sisters have been molested and raped and all of that. I would like to get into discussion with you of how do we move to a national conversation, that is meaningful, that can actually do people some good. As we just saw, 74 million people voted for a man who is an admitted sexual molester of women. Many social leaders, evangelicals, for instance, in communities across America supported the man who committed acts of sexual abuse and by extension his beliefs on sexual molestation. So how do we as a nation get into a national discussion that supports the victims instead of the predators, of those who empower them? And how do we protect victims, especially as children? Me went back some 60 years ago, instead of siding with the predators, because the fallback sentiment of thoughts and prayers just don't work. And we need meaningful legislation. We need action, and we need to go beyond words. So I just wanted to get into this discussion with you on this. So what do you think we have to do here?
Well, it's been my experience, having spent a career, in effect, telling America's story to the world and trying to find ways to communicate with people that spoke a different language, came from a different culture, and in many instances shared similar and different values. In order to have a conversation about any topic, especially one as sensitive as this, you have to have at least 2 people that speak the same language. They share a similar understanding of what the conversation is about. And before I get into that, what I want our readers to understand is what I felt was courage it took for a Black man your age to stand up in a public setting the way you did and talk about the kind of book that you wanted to write. Rarely have I seen any Black person being willing to going to be possible to bring a broad segment of the population along with him, it's going to have to be a population that speaks that language, the language of pain and despair, and as you write about, hopelessness, but more importantly, feeling helpless, feeling overwhelmed. So to have this conversation, I think it's going to have to begin on a micro level. You and several other people who understand that pain and are prepared at this point to have an open and honest conversation about it. The last point I would make to begin is to have this conversation. You're going to have to introduce it at a level within a community where people have had a common experience and they are prepared to have that conversation. It is not going to begin at the level of the 74 million people who voted for a racist, misogynist, sexual predator for a president, because that's not why they voted for him. They voted for him for a litany of other reasons. So we're going to have to begin this at a family level, a community level, at a church level, and then begin to understand how we go forward from there.
With that personal level, with that engagement at the community at that level, it has been my experience that there's always some pushback, and the pushback coming in the form of denial. No, that doesn't happen here. No, that's not how our community deals with these issues. It is such a major topic of denying what has actually happened, certainly within the Black community, but I don't think that is just within the Black community. I think it happens across the board with every race. It's just that we tend to be more strident in our denial that it is actually happening. So what do you think?
I agree with you that there is going to be pushback. You can pick any deeply sensitive topic, theme, and there is initially going to be a great deal of pushback. That is just part of the process. But the reason I inferred that you're going to have to begin this conversation probably within our community is because it is unlikely that you can take this particular topic, go into any predominantly white community-based organization and introduce this topic and have the kind of conversation which leads to revelations about experience and pain. You may ultimately get there.
Yeah.
But I think initially you're going to have this conversation among people who look like you, who can relate to you as you put it, a brother. And that's more than just being a brother as being a sibling, but they've got to look at you through a Black lens and say,
exactly,
I understand
exactly
what this Black man is talking about.
Right.
And there is a shorthand interpretation that goes on there that you would have to basically explain if it was a broader, more mixed audience. Because we may speak the same language, but sometimes it is the nuance, it is the inference, it is the cultural inflection that make the difference in how people understand what you're talking about.
Well, you're absolutely correct when you say, and when I say the word brother, because it has a dual meaning. There is the sibling, and then there's the brother within the Black community who really needs to have this conversation. In our community, so let's just start there. Those cultural touchstones that we need to get to. It could be church, it could be schools, it could be community centers. How do you see this conversation playing out? Because if the very community that I'm looking to have this conversation with is oftentimes the very community where the crimes are taking place, and the
Yeah.
defenses of those crimes are taking place. How do you get past that? You know, your background as policy and analysis, I think it's possible, but it is going to be a long-term proposition to get to a place where we accept the reality of the situation. That certainly in my home, 7 of the 8 children were molested, including myself, and the pushback, the denial was tremendous. And it still exists, even with my mother, knowing that she empowered my stepfather to molest my sisters for almost 20 years.
You're right, but when you talk about how to get started, for example, you have to use the tools that are available to you. Today, what we have is the ubiquity of social media as a way of communicating with a broader but similar audience at the same time. You have already, I think, overcome the most difficult hurdle, and that was to get your siblings to open up, to reveal their pain, be willing to share this with you, and then support you as you try to share their story with a wider audience. That already is a major hurdle to have overcome. They've given you license, if you will, to share this story. They didn't say, you can tell this group, but not that group. They said, we are willing to support what you're doing. The story needs to be told. And they're saying to you, we trust you to use the means available to you to share this story.
Mm-hmm.
So you have social media. You have an entire network of relationships at all levels. And so what that gives you is the opportunity to move instantly beyond your community-based organizations, if you will, to share a story that others will relate to, but meanwhile, closer to home, there will be others willing to respond and say, hey, look, I appreciate what you're doing. I don't appreciate what you're doing. How could you do this? How could you betray us? How could you expose us? There are going to be those too. That is just a natural part of the process. What you have to be willing to do is proceed on dual tracks. One track is to sit down and work with and communicate with those who can empathize with your story, and those who may be opposed but are willing to sit down and talk to you about the basis for their opposition. You may not convert all of them or any of them, but by virtue of the fact that they are willing to communicate with you and you're willing to communicate with them, the outcome of that could be maybe someone in the future might begin to understand the necessity for telling that story. So you've got to operate on 2 tracks simultaneously all the time.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting from my story perspective. I think we've got something here that hasn't been done, and you have been intimately involved with me putting this project out there. So just to have that on the record, you have helped shape my thoughts on this. My siblings who have contributed to this, I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and one of the brothers is my older half brother. And I think having them contribute to this book, and they will contribute to the next 2 books. This is a series from helplessness to hopefulness to happiness. We're talking about the book Helplessness now. I feel that, particularly with my sisters, their contribution to the book, it is not just in ideas and concept. They have physically put themselves in pages in the book. will help
I know.
create the conversation or take it to a broader audience, particularly as it relates to women and sisters.
Yes.
Because you and I are sitting here having this conversation, and I can already see, well, those are just two men. What do they know?
Right.
Those are just two black men. What do they know? They are in the tribe that's been known to attack us. But having my sisters involved gives me an opportunity to have a broader conversation. And of course, most of the women, unless they read the book, won't know that I myself was molested, and my one of my older brothers, for 6 months. So we do have an idea of what that's all about. Having my sisters is going to do a lot, and hopefully even broaden the conversation.
It will. And that's why I said what your readers will come to understand very early on is that your sisters have licensed you to tell their story. That is obvious in the writing. This is not you divorced from the reality as a voyeur looking in and deciding how much of this story you want to tell from a black male's perspective. No, you're telling the story from the perspective of an insider. It is that old television program of the 1950s. You were there.
Yeah.
Your sisters have said, you were there. You may not have known, but you were there. You were outside playing in the street while we were being molested inside. You didn't know that, but you were there. Now, years later, what they're saying to you is, you carried the burden of your guilt, and you have found that a burden difficult to carry for 40 years. Okay, we will bring you into the actual experience of what it was to have been the victim of a predator whose behavior was sanctioned by our mother. We will now help you tell that story, and not only will we help you tell that story, we will sanction your telling that story to the world as a way to try to reach out to others like us who have similar stories to tell, who feel that the story should not die with them, but that the story should culminate into policies, community awareness, family awareness. It should culminate in concrete, specific actions that help us treat the topic delicately but openly as a society and protect the victims at the same time, so people feel comfortable coming forward knowing that they will be respected, that there is due process, that there is fairness, and that sexual predators will be held accountable for their behavior. That does not exist in this society. But we have to start somewhere because there is no end to the number of victims. Victims are being created every day.
Yeah. When you mention victims being created every day, one of the victims or a group of victims that is rarely looked at as a victim are the brothers. Oftentimes, and it's been my experience, brothers, we are overlooked. We are not brought into the conversation. In fact, I have been told that as a brother, I cannot even talk about it because it didn't happen to me. But in fact, it did happen to me. And I'm not even talking about my molestation episode with our babysitter. But if the molestation happens in the family, if the rape happens in the family, the entire family has been molested and raped because the trust has been broken all the way across the entire family. So I look at this from the standpoint of a brother, the pain that I have to carry and the suffering that I have to carry, and obviously the guilt of not knowing what was going on, and then having my own demons trying to figure out how could I not know, what should I have done. and then trying to bring some closure for my sisters. But so many brothers don't get that opportunity. They don't have the opportunity to talk, and they walk in silence. Some even commit suicide after learning that their sisters have been molested or raped by their father or stepfather or someone in the home. So as we move forward with the conversation, how do we go about creating support systems for brothers? You can find many support groups for sisters, for women. But men, because of our macho and the social construct around that, in particular around black men being strong, masculine, we don't find oftentimes the opportunity or give ourselves the opportunity to speak emotionally about this. I struggle with trying to figure out how do I or we as black men create the support systems for us.
I don't think we do that in isolation, and there may be some black women who will take issue with what I'm about to say, but any viable support system for men has to have the active involvement of black women or of women. Because to me, for a woman to say to a man, you cannot talk about this because it happened to me or because you were not a victim, I think it is also incumbent upon that same woman to say, let me tell you why I say that. I know you did not know. And while you may have wanted to do something had you known, I know you did not know. But in order for me to help you help me, let's talk about my experience. I say you cannot speak about it because you don't know. Well, if I don't know, help me. Women have to help their men to be better partners. Women have to help their men to be better listeners, to understand those things that may have transpired, but they were not aware of. You can't just indict someone without explaining the basis for the indictment. I believe that fervently.
Yes.
You have to say to me, I don't want you to write about it because I do want you to write about it because,
right.
But at the same time, she has to say, I want your help. I need your understanding. I need your support. I need your strength. Women have a role to play.
As a friend of ours,
they just indict their men, foist it off on some other force, and then leave us helpless.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
As a woman recently told me that we women have to be careful that we do not weaponize our victimhood against innocent men who we need as you said, as allies. Because as a brother, when I was told that I cannot talk about it, it didn't happen to you, it only happened to us girls, I was put in a box by the very people I needed to speak to, the very people I needed to help me understand, because the trauma hit so hard that I didn't know what to do. And then to have the people who could help me the most lock me down, it was something that locked me down for 40 years. And I really began to understand when she said we cannot use our victimhood as a weapon. I was just recently told that, along the same lines, that you chose to be a victim because you're a man. You chose to be a victim of this. I don't know what man would choose to be a victim who would choose to want to learn that his sister has been molested. No, there was no choosing. There was no choosing. We are a part of the victim group. We might be a slightly different group set aside, but we are still victims. What role do you see law enforcement and religion a teaching tool about how to treat women? but these conversations have to be had. And if they're not had, then there's no learning taking place.
So you have to me, respond directly to your question. Family members, educators, psychologists, psychiatrists, law enforcement, they are all community partners. When you begin to address the kinds of issues that roil most families, one or more of them will be called in to help the victims address their pain or the cause of the problem. So as this conversation begins to move beyond family, unless, of course, there was a violent altercation which involved the law, as this conversation begins to move beyond family organizations into enforcement, to me, has to be part of that conversation simply because often when you have these situations that involve sexual predation or sexual violence or whatever, sometimes without any degree of prior preparation, we bring in law enforcement who bring a very unique perspective that is tinged by their training.
Yep.
It is tinged
Yep.
by racism. It
Yep.
is tinged by sexism.
Yep.
And they come to bring a very simple, violent solution when it involves us. They don't bring
Yes.
the patience, the understanding, or the relationships. So they need to be brought in when the conversation moves to the community level, where we're now trying to create an understanding of what happened, how it happened, what are the conditions, what role do community partners play, so that police, law enforcement can then begin to understand that it is not just a law enforcement situation. This might involve the necessity for bringing in other categories of professionals that have the sensitivity, the training, that literally are part of this community or understand this community. So they are all community partners that will ultimately have to become part of the conversation. Community understanding and a willingness to go forward, can that then begin to translate into calls for specific policy or legislation or law? Asking for it prematurely will not result in any level of satisfaction from people who are responsible for developing public policy.
How do we go about getting men to open up about their trauma and their pain? It took me a long time. It took me over 40 years. And it took a number of people, particularly my wife, telling me that I was a victim. And I denied it. I just denied it flat out until she continued to point out how I was a victim. And I know if it took me that long, it has taken a number of other men that long, if not longer. So how do we get to the conversation where we can at least have the conversation amongst ourselves? Because whereas women will have the conversation amongst themselves, men are not going to talk about this with each other.
We are behaviorally predisposed to avoid having any conversation which questions our manhood.
Yeah.
We are just taught from childhood, our basic socialization. But to answer your question, what it takes, in my view, is someone, and in this case, someone like yourself, that has lived this, who is prepared to put himself out there in a very public way. And today you can do that through personal relationships, organizations, and social media, put yourself out there and talk about the necessity for having this conversation, recognizing that it does not detract from your manhood. It does not make you less of who you think you are to have this conversation. In fact, if anything, it enhances you. It strengthens you. It makes you an even more sensitive and stronger partner to whoever you are partnered with.
I agree with that.
You got
Yes.
to show that this is something that can contribute to the emotional and psychological health of a family, relationships, a community. But someone has to be willing to take the initiative. And this is how I think you begin.
You know, I was talking to my sister the other night, and I told her one of the most empowering, liberating things I have ever done was to come out and talk about my feelings about this. And she says to me, just talking about it, how is it that you feel just comfortable doing it? I said, I didn't feel comfortable. But once I did it, once I was willing to share, not just with you guys, but share with the world, it was so incredibly liberating. And the other day, I was talking to my son, and he said, you know, Dad, I was rereading your book, the manuscript, and I got to talking to my wife about it, and she said to me, how is it that he allowed himself to be so vulnerable and share this story? And his response to her was, he carried this pain for so long that it got to a point where he just could not let it go, that he had to figure out a way to deal with the person who molested his sisters. And as we continued to talk, he said, what happened to me watching you do that was something amazing. I realized that my dad was so much stronger than I thought he was. And I thought you were already strong, but you were so much stronger than I even imagined you were, that I found that it was empowering for me as a young Black man. Now I can talk more about those things that bother me, those emotional things that may in the past have stifled me. And that's what you did for me, reading this. And I think that's the type of thing that could happen for other young men, because it's more the young men who need to know this is how you handle it. This is the conversations you need to have, and not hunker down and hide yourself behind your fear.
And that's true. And see, the solution to every problem begins with a catalyst. Someone that says, there's got to be an answer somewhere. And I'm going to be the one that initiates the search. I'm going to initiate the conversation. I'm going to find the solution. There has to be a catalyst. Otherwise, problems remain problems. They remain unresolved until someone steps forth. So to have that conversation, it takes someone like yourself, and this is where I think it would be really a boon had we been able to launch your foundation, because this becomes one of those themes that you can speak to publicly. And even as we learned in network marketing, you may have an event in which only one person shows up, but you speak to that one person. And what you then build on is the multiplier effect. You have that conversation among or within a social group. You have it within a fraternity. You have it within a church. You have it at a family picnic. You set aside a moment when the guys get together. But the thing is, you seek those moments when willing to listen and maybe share. But you have to be consistent and you have to be persistent. And that's where you begin.
Mm-hmm.
That's where most things begin that have at their core a problem that needs to be resolved. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah. Well, that has been mine too. Hopefully this book project, this 3-book project goes well. It does become the catalyst for the launch of the foundation, where we can get into more policy discussions and deal with more of these issues that need to be addressed. We have a couple of minutes left here, George. Is there...
We've gone through 40 minutes already.
Just about, my friend, just about. And like I said, you and I, we could talk about this stuff for days and weeks at a time and still not have to take a breath. You know, I would love to continue this conversation on another podcast, and we can get more deep into aspects of this and the book. But as we get ready to close this out, how do you want to end it? What message is there that you'd like to leave us with?
It's kind of a complex message, but to simplify it, I would say that any problem that has affected your relationship, it has caused you to doubt yourself as a man. Any problem that renders you unable to fulfill what you consider to be your role within a family or within a group or an organization, I say address it. Do not rely entirely upon your own devices because, you know, we are a community, and especially within the Black community, this is how we have survived for over 400 years. Ultimately, we have to depend upon each other. Even initially, we have to do that. And so, as we go forward, let's think about ways in which we can strengthen our community, our relationships, our families. And to do that, we have to be willing to look at some of the most painful experiences, the painful aspects of our lives, and then be willing to address them. Only then are we going to be able to have the society respond to us in a way which lets us know that we are full and equal partners. But we have a role, we have a responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that begins with our responsibility to ourselves.
George, it has been an absolute honor having you here. I completely agree with everything that you've had to say. This is why you were the only person I felt I could have this conversation with. Thanks for taking a few moments and sharing your thoughts on this. And I'll just have to keep going with the fight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. You are a friend. I feel as though I have made this journey with you. And I think what we should do is just continue this conversation because we've got a long way to go.
Yes.
I think you started something here that will ultimately gain traction. And so let's just continue the fight.
All right, my friend. Thanks, George.
Thank you.